Beautiful. Okay, cool. So welcome back, everyone, to those who went to Dash. Excellent meeting. Um, really looking forward to the next one. Let's
Yep,
see.
long time no see.
It's been a bit. It's been a bit. Um, so today we were gonna have John Niehoff kind of talk through this FEP process that he and I'm not sure who all has worked on it, John, actually.
It's
Um,
pretty much just me. So,
okay, wow, that is a hefty document. I'm impressed.
well, no, I stole it all from. Well, we'll discuss it.
Fair enough. But I put the link, pretty sure I gave you all the right one. Let me double check. Yep, I put the link to that document just now in the chat. So feel free to skim through that as we're all chatting. This is supposed to be a really discussion-based telecon, so don't hold back, give your thoughts. Sean, did you have any quick things to note before we start?
I don't think I have anything right now. No.
Cool. All right. Well then, John, if you'd like to kick us off.
Excellent. Yeah, and I'm going to talk to a few slides here with the idea being of some framing and kind of seeing if this basic idea works out for folks. Oh, can I see the chat? Oh, I can see the chat. Good. So please don't go deep into the Google because that's sort of assuming answers to a lot of stuff here already. So what's really got me thinking about this was the idea of being able to find a document consensus among this community. We have our standards document that's 5 years old now, and having one of those can be kind of inflexible. It makes it hard to respond quickly. And there were some updates that were discussed in 2019, but have not been kind of acted on since. So that's kind of the motivation here, is to think about how do we find consensus and document it. I was kind of thinking, well, we've got kind of three things, right? We've got the standards, which we have an example of, which are at least binding on the core packages and strongly recommended for others. The idea of having some sort of informational stuff, guidelines, best practices. Again, we've kind of talked a lot about these, but there doesn't seem to be a really good stream for them to flow into. So, have best practices, maybe not quite a how-to, but maybe shading into that. And finally, process, which is kind of what we're talking about here, is capture how we go about doing things. So roughly my thought is we probably want to have something where people come up with proposals, which we're in this step right now of the broad process. Have some sort of community input discussion, have some sort of approval, and some sort of means of retiring or replacing these. So this is the very broad approach. And this is kind of modeled on the Python PEPs and the NEPs and SunPy's process, which are very similar to the Internet Engineering Task Force RFC process, which is why I wound up slapping the awkward label of FEP on this. And if people have better names, I certainly would not object to them, but it was something to work with. So the path I'm kind of thinking of is taking PEP 1, which is the PEP that describes PEPs from the Python project. I went through and just did sort of the obvious rewrites of stuff that doesn't apply to us. So for instance, BDFL references Go, steering committee goes, because we don't really have one of those. And then I did a bunch of comments. So that's why there's just a lot of green text of me suggesting stuff as sort of a potential starting point. But the bulk of the writing there is copy pasted from PEP 1. So the hope is that if people find this idea credible, I'll go through, approve all my suggestions, so we can continue to iterate on that, moving towards something we can all get behind. Thought was to maybe approve this at the fall meeting in a telecon, and this was written before the fall meeting got replaced by Dash, so we can decide how to go for the approval later. And one of the things this might bias is the ability to take our existing standards document and maybe break it up into a couple of different documents that can be updated independently with their own DOIs and such. And so the thought was maybe we just take our standards and break them along the lines that we used for the project grading guidelines. So having a FEP that describes our community approach, documentation, testing maturity, so on and so forth. So this is the part where I want to actually start conversing. So I've talked for like 5 minutes, so that's good. So do people agree that we need a process like this, whether it is in details?
John, can you step back and give an example of something that people might be submitting to the FEP? Because I understand like for SunPy, what kind of requests people would make, but for PyHC, what would be the kinds of things that people would be suggesting?
So let me go back to this, right? So suggestions tend to come up of we should require X or project should do Y. And so I suggest we
Like
have
everyone should use matplotlib for plotting, that kind of thing, or
that
everyone
kind of,
should have a README? I mean,
yeah. So right now we have our everyone should X in one standards document. And let me take just this one here, containing support for new Python. Yeah, Jack suggested the unified coordinate description, right? So containing support for new Python. So we might specify, I think Nick was coming up with the very reasonable idea of the core packages should support new versions of Python within 6 months of their release, right? And so that and anything else that we want to talk about in terms of how packages should deal with oncoming new other packages, dependencies, could be something that we write up in a document like this and approve. So this would be kind of an example of a standards track, FEP, because I'm just going to keep using the name because we need a name. Example of a best practices FEP might be something more like, these are suggestions for how you go about dealing with continuous integration, right? And then the third category, the process one, this itself is an example of, just kind of how we're going to make decisions, how are we going to work together. So, and there's stuff in the chat people should look at it, and Greg particularly pointed out there's a bigger scientific Python one that maybe we should look at and work to coordinate with. And Rebecca has a hand up.
I had a hand up, but other people said plenty of examples, so never mind.
Okay. So yeah, that's the idea, is we've kind of done this on an ad hoc basis, starting with the first meeting, of course, where we just all got together and said, yes, this is what we can find consensus on. But there's been stuff floating about, and we don't have a formal process for making sure that the appropriate set of people are on board before we declare something. Any other thoughts on the need or not?
I mean, I agree that this fills a role, at least in my agenda. I mean, or at least it gives us a place to put like stretch goals, which I think is nice.
Yep.
Because I've got a few of those in mind.
Yeah, and so there's nothing saying we can't start with stuff as expressed as a best practice that then we eventually revisit and declare a standard.
Yep. If I can call you out for a second, Nick, you said Plasma Pi does a plep process. Is it very similar to what we're discussing about here for PyHC, or is it categorically different in some way?
It's fairly similar. We've had reasonably good luck with it, though we have not used it very much. Apart from the first round of 5 or 6, we've only had like 2 or 3. So it doesn't get used very often. I think the downside is, the upside is that we do have a process for this sort of thing. The downside is that it can be time intensive. And I'm also wondering, maybe we should have a steering council.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Time intensive, meaning like it takes a long time to review, like when people put in suggestions, or what? Like what's time consuming about it?
To write mostly.
To write. Gotcha.
Yeah. And then sometimes to get people together to discuss it.
So I will say, based on my concept that this is an everything bucket, is if we want to form a steering council, we could describe how to do it.
Yep.
I will also say that the big difference between what I'm proposing here and like, NEP or the SunPy SEPs or the original PEPs is that those also include technical plans for changing the code base. Which of course is less relevant for PyHC because we don't have a single code base. It's more of setting what standards we would like to be sharing.
I'm also seeing in the comments that SunPy's process is named SEP. So I'm feeling like FEP is kind of a perfectly fine name. It seems to blend right in.
SEP is also a joke in SunPy for solar. It's solar energetic particles.
Ah, nice.
We try our best.
One thing that's coming to mind here is that this could be a way to sort of even more formalize the PyOpenSci requirements that we sort of get when we start that process, because there's a few extra rules and requirements and stuff we have to tack on to ours to comply to PyOpenSci, and if we had them all written down in a FEP first, then that just feels a little bit more official and like go from one to the other.
Yeah, and I was thinking this also could help with what you and Julie were discussing last week of having kind of the second level of expectations on packages, of being able to document that.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it feels like we're good with this first one. I don't see anybody saying nah, ad hocery is good or sufficient.
Yeah.
Actually, I can provide some evidence to the contrary that ad hoc is making people drive away from PyHC a bit and undervalue it, in my opinion. So that one comment I heard at IDEA, I think it was, although the two workshops are now blending together in my head, was that someone came up to me and said, well, now that there's this PyHC environment thing where everything's going to be working together, that, PyHC might be worthwhile considering. It's like, oh, well, okay. So if we do some more solid efforts towards some sort of standardization, I think that'll be more worthwhile to the community.
Yeah, I think it makes us more visible.
Interesting. That's a good point.
So bring out some gavels.
And having some sort of like shared ownership of some actual things that we have meetings around, like, hey, everyone who's a part of PyHC is now a part of this Python virtual environment. That's a very concrete, actionable thing we're working on. Now everyone's going to be looking at these standards proposals. Like, yeah, just actually giving a more concrete definition to what is PyHC and what does PyHC membership entail and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Rebecca.
Sure.
So the next question I had is this general workflow of formal, I shouldn't say formal, but concrete proposal, discussion, approval, and then potentially replacing retiring, is this make sense, or is there, it's a very generic description, but I want to see if it seemed reasonable.
I'm a fan of it, especially considering that right now we don't really have an official process for doing things other than enough people mention it enough times that we eventually just kind of fold it in. It would be nice to have structure.
And the reason for this, so this is both kind of what emerged to me from PEP 1 and the RFC process, but I also feel it's nice that you're starting hopefully from a fairly concrete basis, very explicitly getting input, separating out the input and the approval potentially. And it's just a fairly nice process of making sure you know what you're talking about at any given time, so it doesn't just turn into a hairball. All right, so given that, does basing this on PEP1 make sense? I mean, to some extent, it feels like the community has voted with their feet because the SEPs are fairly close to that, NEPs are fairly close to that. I apologize, Nick, that I did not actually look at the PLEPs or cite them. I'll add that to the slides.
Oh, no worries whatsoever. Yeah, I think maybe if we could do a lightweight version of PEP1.
Yeah, I would agree that just because we structure it after something doesn't mean we have to have the full machinery.
Yeah, that seems like an analogy for Python packaging.
So given that, okay, so I am asserting we have decided we're going to base off of PEP1, and obviously there will be scope for people to object and modify later. This gets into nuts and bolts, and I think people can, we don't need to resolve this all today. And this is stuff that will be reflected in that document. What I'm going to do is go into that and open it up for suggestion for everybody, so we've got much broader input. But I'll basically be trying to manage and editorialize, but not be the only person doing the writing. So where should we develop these and where should we archive them? My baseline thing is, well, we probably have a GitHub repo and get a DOI with Zenodo. Ultimately, it's the.
I mean, that was going to be my first suggestion.
Sorry, Julie.
Yeah, the thing that makes immediate sense to me would just be a document in the document section of our website. And, that is in GitHub. So there would be a file in GitHub to link to. And it also occurs to me that we haven't made a blog post on the PyHC homepage since the spring meeting. So we could make a blog post about this and leave it up there for a while so people would, go to the homepage and see a link to a document that they could go click on and play with maybe.
Sure. But once we finalize it, it needs to have a DOI and Zenodo. I agree.
Yeah, and that's one of the. I think we can leave this open question if we dump this in the website repo or if we have a separate repo just for this.
Two comments. Whenever this comes out, and even in the initial version, it should have a permanent link to it from the website, so it's not just buried in the repo. But the other thing is that I would imagine some sort of review or feedback process would include the GitHub issues and possible pull requests and stuff like that. So if you want that to be shown on the history of the website development GitHub, then sure. If you want it separate but linked, I mean, you could put it in a separate GitHub.
So we have a separate GitHub within the PyHC overall organization called standards. We could probably put this in that.
Seems to make sense.
It's not an overly huge repo to begin with, so it wouldn't be like throwing something into the ether.
Makes sense to me.
And Rebecca, I totally agree with the permanent link from the website, and beyond the individual proposals and such, we will want to have some sort of table of contents or index, sorry, just to make it easy to go, okay, these are the 5 ones that are actually standards track and approved, and then here's the 20 best practices and our 3 policy ones or whatever, just so that it's easy for people to kind of get in and see them. So the individual ones are immutable once approved, but we've got some machinery around it to help people find the relevant ones.
Cool. Yeah.
Right. This actually kind of loops back to the steering committee. So there's a role in the PEP1 process for an editor, which is kind of the person who is not the advocate for a PEP, not the author of it, but somebody who is managing the motion through the process. And so that's a fair bit of PEP1 is occupied with defining those and such. I'm not sure, do we need them? Do we not? So I want to throw that open, or should people? I have a suspicion that if we don't have somebody who's responsible for the actual process, it's probably going to fall on Julie. So, and maybe we start that way too, right? Because we can always modify this.
Mhm. I mean, I don't mind being volunteer distribute, at least initially.
Yep. And being an editor of something like this doesn't scare me, at least at the moment. It's not so big that I would run to the hills. So might be able to walk down to the fort without someone else here.
Do we
Oh.
want, how many editors do we want for this kind of thing?
I don't think we're going to have a good idea right off the bat.
Okay, cool.
But that is a good point. If we say that it must be Julie and Sean, or it must be people supported by the grant, that does make it harder to add other people later.
Yeah, I don't think we need to restrict ourselves to that.
Okay.
It'll be good to define what the editor is responsible for
I do agree
before
with
we
that.
pick who.
Yeah. And again, it's the most of what I'm looking for here is, do I go and delete everything in PEP 1 that says editor? And it sounds like the answer is no. Where do we want to have the discussion?
GitHub discussions.
So options would include, so the GitHub discussions, the issues, right? Like if this is opened as a PR, having the discussion in the PR, we could also do mailing list. We could do element/Slack. Those are kind of all of the channels that we communicate in.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we consolidate that to keep the record of discussion on GitHub.
Yeah, having the record in one place does seem valuable.
I mean, that doesn't remove the option from the email list. You just include the link to the GitHub discussion page.
Mm-hmm.
And I envision some people might do some amount of back and forth on Slack or something, or element, to Will's comment. But that does not count as discussion of record until it's in the PR.
Yeah, I do agree with that. We do bridge Slack to Element, so what happens in Slack happens in Element too, vice versa.
But also, I'm sitting here thinking that it might not be too hard to like add a place for discussion later. Like, just I'm imagining this first getting off the ground with, maybe one PR on GitHub, and then for a while the only place to give official comments is just the PR. And I don't think we'll need any more than that, at least until like we get a version 1 approved and like stuck somewhere.
Yeah, it can also be changed. So part of the reason I brought this up is because I'm kind of violating my own suggestions here. I'm suggesting, markdown, pull requests in GitHub, and I put this up as a Google Doc with suggestions. So the advantage of the Google Doc is that suggestion feature works really well, although you can do the line-by-line commenting in the GitHub pull request. So yeah, I want to throw that out there and see what people have to think about that. I am perfectly happy, honestly, to scratch that Google Doc and go straight to the GitHub at this point, or to continue this development in GitHub for a bit. Sorry, in Google.
So Jack put a comment in the chat about SEPs for SunPy. I'd be interested to hear from the people already using this process about what worked for them.
Yeah, good point.
All of it happens on the on the PR for the SCP. So we have the SCP repo that both Jack and Laura linked, and when an SCP is proposed, a PR is opened and the iteration happens on that PR, on that repo.
Yeah, I'm in favor of keeping it from the get-go in one place in GitHub.
Yeah, I think we found that process works pretty well, and that it's also all publicly visible as
Yeah.
as well. So, and I mean, yeah, I mean, I was taking kind of cheap shots at Slack in the chat, but at the same time, like even on Element, it's still like that discussion is sort of ephemeral. Like it's there, right? But it's harder to find as well. You know, even if it's recorded for all time, it's a bit more visible on some place like GitHub.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will go through with kind of the immediate stuff and then migrate it over to a PR against the standards repository. Sounds like the way to go. Yeah, we talked about that.
Yeah, being able to call out line by line and have discussions on particular sentences, that has happened in SEPs, so it's useful.
Yeah, they tend to involve a lot of legalese, which people have strong opinions about.
Yeah.
It's your chance to pretend to be a lawyer.
I'm going to take this whole idea back and go and walk away. All right. Okay, so I think we've talked about that. And then there's a question of approval. There's been the question here of who has a vote on pretty much anything. Is it core packages? Is it members poorly defined? Everybody who's there. So I'm going to throw my suggestions out. My suggestion is anybody who's present gets a chance to vote. If you're bothering to stand up, you should be able to talk. Where I would strongly advocate for 2 rounds. That is that the people present need to approve it at one point, and then again, this is the process that's used for rule changes, another volunteer thing I'm involved with, and people do think of things between the votes. And my bias here is towards stability in a sense, which is let's not do stuff unless people really are behind it, and if not, then figure out why. Similarly, I think if somebody has actual objections, that should be a reason to try to revisit. So this is maybe not quite unanimity, but that there's nobody who says, no, this doesn't work. The combination of everybody voting with no objectors does mean there's a chance for people to kind of show up and throw a wrench in things just to be jerks. But I honestly think that becomes a code of conduct issue more than anything else. And then similarly, I think if it's been approved and then stuff has to be changed, I think you need to have 2 more votes, not just 1 more. That really, by the time you're voting or approving, it should be on a fairly static thing. Yeah, I think that's my set of things. Thoughts on this?
I like it. It's very in the community spirit in the way that we've adopted things in the past, with a bit more structure.
Here's a thought though.
Yeah.
There's a lot of packages that have opinions one way or another, and you can easily have 15 people from a single package show up and sway the vote there. So maybe limit it to 1 vote per package or 2 votes per packages or whatever you want to do.
That feels to me like an argument in favor of the no objectors approach, because if you're not going for a majority vote, then it doesn't matter how many people from a given package are present. If you have all of the SunPy developers show up and there's one other person who says no, then I think we should listen to that no.
But I wonder if that's going to shoot us in the foot. If there's, say, a package that doesn't want to agree to a standard interface, say for unit conversions, but almost every other package is either already doing it or working on it or planning to. I feel like that could shoot us in the foot if we go with a standard of no objections. But I'm not sure where the right middle ground is.
Could the standard be something like no objections from core package developer groups?
I think that gives too much power to core packages. And then with the new 3-tier levels of memberships, maybe preferring core packages is the wrong way to go. Maybe preferring the gold standard packages would be the way to go, or then that seems wrong too. I think this needs to be discussed more largely.
Yeah, well, and again, this is sort of the initial right, and we can revise before approval and even after. The reason I went for this is it's a question of how much we want this to be a mechanism for capturing consensus that exists versus pulling laggards into line. I lean much more towards the consensus, particularly because the truly effective sticks that we have in this community are pretty few. And if there is something that needs to become a true like hard line, that is often implemented through the funding lines. And if we have, so I have an example. So if we say there's something that people very firmly believe should be an actual standard, that should be a hard requirement, everybody should do this, but there are a couple of people who don't, then one way forward would be to change that from a shall to a should. And this is, a strong consensus. This is pushing people in direction, but not forcing it. And then that's reflected. Maybe in the future, people will get in line and decide, nope, this wasn't so bad. We can make this a shall. And maybe NASA will say, you have to do all of the shells as well as the shoulds for this particular funding line.
That sounds good. One thing I want to say here is that we're starting PyHC. I can see this happening quite soon. But I see PyHC looking towards becoming more of an international organization. So don't lean too much on NASA, on NASA's requirements.
I would also say we want as much as possible for us to be driving things and not having it pushed down. But there's a balance.
What do you mean push down? I'm not following.
Oh, so I was just saying if it's really a hard line, then NASA can impose that, but I would like that to happen as little as possible. As much as possible, we set the standards that then we're judged by in our proposals.
Okay.
Agreed.
All right, so that's all I've got. What I'm hearing for kind of my next step would be, obviously Julie, I'll make sure you have these. They can go in the records. And then I will open a pull request against the standards repository with a markdown version of this for us to continue to work on. And I'll send an announcement out to the mailing list that is there and available for discussion.
Perfect.
So thanks. I wanted to, kind of come in with this idea and hopefully not feel too much like I was imposing some sort of diktat. And sounds like people are thinking in similar enough ways we can sort this out. Thanks.
Yeah, no, this sounds like exactly like the kind of thing we need, especially as we're sort of on the cusp of like implementing some fairly big changes and coalescing some wishes into actual things that exist. And this sounds like an important mechanism to do that all in like a nice coordinated way. So yeah, thank you.
Big thanks to you for this initial effort.
Yeah, thanks all for listening.
Yeah, like one thought that I just never rattled off my head was that it's going back to the hypothetical situation where we have like a holdout on some things, like maybe one person really doesn't want to bump up to the latest NumPy or use a particular units kind of thing. I've always wondered in my head how that was going to be addressed because I figured that was going to happen no matter what sooner I mean, then later eventually, because we're coordinating a bunch of humans and not everyone agrees on how to do things. And I'd never had a good answer in my head for how to address that kind of thing, but having a formal mechanism to at least capture what like the consensus of the field is, so that we know when people are going against consensus, is like the first sane approach to resolving that in my head. So yeah, this solves a problem for me.
Yeah, I think ultimately the question is, do you want those people at the table or not? You don't want them in the way of, obstructing process, but you don't want them to declare PyHC irrelevant. So
yeah. And I can't imagine it being that big of a problem. Like I do struggle to come up with examples that are so extreme that it would be like one person holding up something. But hey, I shouldn't, say, hey, just because I can't think of a creative way someone could cause a problem for me, that it won't happen. So
well, so the initial meeting, the topic of a condo was a pretty tough one. I was not ready to agree that condo was a requirement, just because I was seeing the amount of work required for that. And ultimately, folks agreed to make it a strong recommendation instead of requirement, and that made things happy-ish.
Yeah.
Nice.
Do we have any more thoughts or comments on this? So after this has been in GitHub for a while and we've talked it through and we come up with some sort of, not finalized, but more put together draft, we should probably have another telecon and talk about it.
Yeah, so I would say that whatever approval process is in here would also apply to the document itself. And I would envision that as 2 successive meetings of some sort. It would be great to have one of those be a meeting,
Yeah.
and not just a telecon, at least for this one. That would limit us to only being able to fully approve these things twice a year.
Sure.
Which honestly might not be a bad idea.
No, I agree.
So
It feels important that it needs to be one event where it's expected that a majority of PyHC people are going to show up, which are things like the spring meeting. It feels like that's a requirement to have fair voting, do it at one of those. But then, giving a secondary place like a telecon and maybe even like a survey monkey or something, who knows, just like other secondary things. And if that limits us to only twice a year, then so be it.
We could also sorry, thinking on the cuff here, I'll put something in, because GitHub has the review mechanism. That could be a means. I don't think it should be the definitive thing, but I think it can be a means of expressing approval or disapproval. And if you get to the point where you've got no changes requested and several people have said, yes, this is good, that's an indication that it's time to go to an actual discussion at the meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Seems reasonable.
Right. So it'll be a week or two before I get this up, but I promise I will not forget about it.
Thanks, John.
I guess, are we having an official get together at AGU, or will that be an informal sidebar?
At the moment, we don't have an official get together, but.
So it sounds like the target should be that maybe we have this up in time to have offline discussion, have another telecon for it, and potentially be in a position to approve at the spring meeting.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Okay.
Yep. And yeah, just reminding people who weren't at Dash or forgot since then that we have a poster session at AGU this year, not a get up and talk session. Mm-hmm. But that also means we'll be spending most of the time just hanging out in a poster hall together so we can chat about things.
That's probably better anyway, to be honest.
Yeah, there's pros and cons to both, but the nice part about the poster is we do have a lot longer for discussions and face-to-face interaction.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, it seems like we've got consensus on this. No reason to stretch out the whole hour if we don't need it.
Yeah. Julie, this definitely feels like a meeting where I should generate meeting notes with our good old friend GPT.
Yeah.
So could you send me the recording for this after we end?
Yeah, and if you could send me those notes back, I'll clean it up then.
Perfect.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. See you again in 2 weeks' time. It's going to be Sean presenting his PyHC chat.
Yes.
Get excited.
Thanks, John. Thanks all.
Thanks,
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
John.
Thanks, everyone.